Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Tuesday Tips. As always, I'm Michael Barber here on our Grow Schools channel. Welcome you into a conversation with Nina Rees. Nina, it's so good to have you back on the show. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Just want to let everyone know I am suffering from a little bit of a post-Thanksgiving cold. So if you recognize this very raspy voice or hear this very raspy voice, you will understand. I've got my tea here to hopefully keep the throat in shape as we get through the next 15 to 20 minutes of conversation. But if you do notice that my voice takes a dive, you will know why. It is that clearly being around too much family and kids who have brought the viral plagues from school into our households over Thanksgiving. And I am suffering with a little cold as a result. But the show must go on, as they say. But we're really pleased to welcome Nina in to have a conversation on what's going to happen and what's going to impact charter leaders in 2025, given the outcomes of both the federal and state elections over the past few weeks. We've obviously spent almost a month since our November elections, and most of the ballots have been counted at this point. There's been some big impacts to what will likely be, some challenges, maybe some potential wins for charter school leaders. And we asked Nina to come in because, as you're all aware, former president of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, as well as a senior fellow at the George W. Bush Institute. So we're really pleased to have her here because she's got such an informed perspective on these questions. Nina, I'm going to ask you first, given the sort of trifecta win at the federal level, obviously we've got President Trump returning to the White House and what looks like a Senate that is very much in Republican hands and, about a 50-50 split in the House, very, very close, but more leaning certainly Republican. And so given that trifecta, what do you think some of the key opportunities and challenges are going to be for charter school leaders as we look at within the current political environment as we head into 2025?
Well, thanks again for having me, Michael. I've been watching a lot of podcasts and discussions about this topic, and it's fair to say that the playbook that this administration is going to use is very different from the playbook of previous administrations. And I'm speaking here as someone who's been in this town since 1991, back when Bob Michel was the minority leader of the House, and having worked on several presidential campaigns as a volunteer and on a transition team. I think anyone who is giving you predictions, unless they have been to Mar-a-Lago and are close to President Trump, is giving their best guess as to what's going to happen. And I was trying to think of a movie that everyone should watch in preparation for what's up next, and I couldn't come up with a great one. Maybe the last season of Game of Thrones. I don't know. Gladiator, I don't know. So all this to say, there are three things that the soon-to-be president has said on this campaign consistently. One is to abolish the Department of Education. He's talked a lot about sending power back to states and localities and about school choice, empowering parents. And these three things are actually not necessarily as a strategy kind of coming together to improve student achievement in a consistent way. When they talk about our poor academic standing on international tests, such as the PISA and the TIMSS, for instance, the countries that do really well on those tests are not countries that have robust choice programs. They have a centralized bureaucratic system that has a set curricula. Parents themselves invest a lot of money in tutoring their kids and getting them to elite programs after school in order to do well on tests. So with all that said, I think of the school choice measures that are likely to have the greatest impact potentially on charter schools, there is a bill that's waiting in the House and the Senate that's gathered a fair number of co-sponsors on the Republican side, which would offer tax breaks to individuals who give money to scholarship granting organizations that then give those funds to parents to go to a school or program of their choice. If that passes, that would be a huge win for the Trump administration and for the school choice sector, because it would be a national program, regardless of the state that you're in, whether that state has an ESA or choice program, you stand to benefit from these scholarships. So I think he's probably going to put a lot of energy into that. If I were him, I would put my energy into that because it would, check that box and do it in a way that would potentially bring a lot of individuals in the choice community together. The sector is not as cohesive and coordinated as possible. This measure, of course, doesn't impact charter schools, since charter schools are not private schools. But it's going to give momentum to the cause of choice and create a greater discussion potentially at the state level around other ways to empower parents to exercise their choices because most kids are ultimately still going to be in the public setting. 90% of them are in public schools. As far as abolishing the Department of Education, I just want to address that as well. Yes, he needs a 2/3 majority in the Senate to pass it, but this is also a president who is talking about getting rid of the FBI and a lot of other agencies, and hasn't been shy about, defying conventional wisdom and also pushing the envelope on the rule of law. So regardless of the legality of using your executive power to do these things, I wouldn't be surprised if he took some opportunities to push the envelope. As you know, with the legal system, it always takes a while for the law to catch up with what's happened. So I don't know about the abolishing the department, but the fact that he's put Linda McMahon as the Secretary of Education does give you kind of a feel as to where he's headed, because she didn't want to be the Secretary of Education. Bringing an outsider makes it easier to disrupt, since she's not as familiar and hasn't been in that organization before, and she's very close to the president. That's a good thing, because she will be heeding his advice and executing what he wants. So I do think they're going to use their budget powers also to signal where they're headed. The head of the Office of Management and Budget was the author of Project 2025. And if you look at Project 2025, there are a lot of indications of what the president's budget could look like if he wanted to take a page out of it, including moving a lot of programs to other agencies and zeroing out or block granting a fair number of programs. So anything could happen. I think it's fair to say that we are in kind of an uncharted territory. But the good thing about the charter school movement is that it's a state-based effort mostly, and your funding and all of your rules and regulations come primarily at the state and local level. So this is one instance where you're shielded from some of the chaos at the federal level. But of course, you're getting money from Title I and IDEA and all these other big funding streams. And I don't think those programs are necessarily going to go away, because they have such a sweeping constituency. And of course, our sector also benefits from it.
Yeah, for sure. It's going to be very interesting. I think you hit the nail on the head with understanding what might happen unless you are actually sitting in those conversations and meetings in Mar-a-Lago right now of what may be on the horizon. I don't think many of us know. We're just going to have to be obviously tuned in to where we can get information in the right places and hopefully be able to impact where we can. You mentioned really good turn for the next question, just the impacts at the state level. We obviously had a variety of bills at the state level, whether it's Kentucky's Amendment 2, Nebraska's Private Choice Bill, Colorado Amendment 80, all these different bills. I want to talk specifically about Kentucky's Amendment 2. It garnered a lot of attention just because of the potential impact on school choice policies. I want to talk specifically how you think it relates in the context of broader trends in public support for school, for or against school choice, obviously believing that it did fail ultimately. Just want to understand what you think of what happened with Kentucky's Amendment 2 and impacts for the future.
Yes, so Kentucky is actually very near and dear to my heart, because when I was at the National Alliance, we passed the law twice. The first time it didn't have any funding attached to it. The second time it was supposed to have money attached to it. Anyway, so we've never been able to create a charter school in Kentucky since the passage of the law. And part of it hinges on the way their state constitution is drafted. I would not read too much into that particular defeat and the defeat of the other measures that we're going to talk about in a minute, primarily because amending the Constitution and taking these things to voters is extremely difficult for two reasons. First of all, when you go to the ballot box and you have these ballot measures behind your ballot, unless it's pretty self-explanatory, unless you really know what they are, you're likely to not vote for them. That's kind of one of the research, from a research standpoint, most people don't pay attention to these ballot referenda and initiatives. The second thing is, if the opposition is mobilized and spreading a lot of negativity about the ballot measure, your odds of passing it go down even further. So I would submit to you that amending the Constitution to allow the legislature to send money to non-public education, which was the way this was drafted, probably was a scary value proposition for a state that had a great tradition of local control. And of course, one of the laggards when it comes to passing charter schools and whatnot. So I'm not surprised that it didn't pass. But I also don't think that one should read too much into it, because the way this thing was phrased made it seem as if public funds would leave public schools in order to go to non-public settings. And the opposition certainly was mobilized to fight the measure pretty strongly.
Okay, good reflections there on potentially how it reflects broader support. And certainly I love your insights on when voters are asked for constitutional amendments, unless they fully understand them, they're more likely to vote no. That's good insights for us. Let's turn to Nebraska. There was a repeal of their private school choice bill. Any lessons we can learn broadly about, the movement and or for charter leaders about that repeal?
Well, it was a measure that repealed a recently enacted program, a $10 million program that would have opened the door to private schools. So it didn't have an impact on charter schools. Nebraska, like North Dakota, South Dakota, and states like Kentucky, is a laggard when it comes to promoting choice. It is a very rural state and has had a mobilized opposition by school districts really against any measure that would take public dollars away from public schools to go to private schools. So again, I wasn't super surprised. The only time that a choice-related measure has passed was in 2012. This was a charter school law that passed in Washington State, and an amendment to the Constitution in Georgia that passed the same year. And that year, that Janus case was the flavor of the month, and the unions were spending a lot of energy fighting some of the teacher pension-related issues that were on both the ballot and kind of the topic that was being discussed by legislatures. So they were not spending as much money fighting those measures. So the one in Washington State that opened the door to charter schools passed with a $12 million investment by the pro-charter sector. And the one in Georgia passed, I don't know exactly how much was spent. Those are the only two instances I can think of where these things have actually been enacted, but it took a lot of effort, money, and also they came up in years where the opposition wasn't solely focused on defeating them. This was not that year. As you know, the unions were very mobilized and paying a lot of attention to some of these races, especially the private choice cases.
I want to turn specifically to Colorado's Amendment 80. I think when we were first discussing what we wanted to chat about here, we were still seeing whether it was going to fail or not. I'm actually just checking some of the news stories this morning, and that it ultimately did fail, if I understand correctly. I want to talk about sort of, ripple effects there, just because it is very oriented towards school choice measure. Again, is this a question of just voters not understanding what their vote means? It's an amendment to the Constitution, similar to what we saw in Kentucky, or is there something different here?
Yes, and so this one was a particularly vague measure because it was an amendment to the state constitution to open the door for school choice, and that was it. And this is a state that has a strong tradition of public school choice, charter schools, certainly one of the first states to pass a charter school law, and a pretty strong charter school law, I would add. So I do think the vagueness of this particular measure and the fact that, again, it was amending the Constitution was at issue. So my advice to anyone who wants to do initiatives and referenda is to start early, raise a lot of money, make sure your message is simple, and also plant these measures in a year where your opposition is not so mobilized against you and against these types of measures. And again, I don't know if you're going to ask me about Texas, but going forward, I mean, the Texas legislature is poised to pass a sweeping piece of legislation that would address a lot of funding equity issues for charter schools, as well as enacting education savings accounts. So I think, we should talk about what happens in Texas, a very big state, a state that's tried to do this in the past and has failed. But the fact that there's that much momentum in a big state like that is also an indication of what's to come. So I don't, also from a polling standpoint, when you ask people about choice and options, again, depending on how you ask the question, you're going to get different answers. But there's generally a lot of momentum right now in favor of giving parents more options and more opportunities rather than less.
Yeah, let's turn to Texas really quickly. Would love your thoughts on what's happening at the state legislature level. Obviously, a lot happening in that state. Obviously, a super strong supporter of school choice. Would love to hear your thoughts on what might transpire over the next few months and years in the state of Texas.
Well, I mean, as you recall, in the last session, they teed up this choice measure and it didn't have enough votes to pass. And the governor and a lot of choice advocacy organizations spent a lot of money to defeat those members who had voted against them, a lot of whom were Republicans in rural communities. They were able to replace them with pro-choice candidates. So I do think they have the votes. Now, anything could happen between now and then. It will be interesting to see if the measure also gathers support from Democrats. But if it passes, it will be a huge, I started doing this work, again, 1993, and I never thought Texas would get to a place where it could enact a law this sweeping. So as far as the place to really focus on, I think that's the place where we potentially could see a lot of change. But, look, there are other places that have enacted sweeping choice legislation and have already paved the way to show us how a system that's governed by parents making options could work, Florida being one of them. And when you look at Florida, what's really interesting is not just the number of options between public and private and charter and magnet and whatnot, but you also have rising student achievement, a closure of the achievement gap. So for a very long time, Florida has just been this example of how you can do this in a way that also moves the needle forward on the academic achievement side. And it's going to be interesting to see how these other states compete with Florida going forward because they have so many options on the table.
Yeah, I mean, the other one that pops into my mind just on, giving parents as much choice as possible is certainly Arizona, and the voucher program that's come through over the last few years.
Yes.
Obviously, I know there's been challenges from a funding perspective, and Arizona's going to have to figure out how to plug those budget challenges when it comes to vouchers. But it will be interesting to watch over the next year to two as we see Texas move forward, how Arizona is going to handle some of the budget challenges related to school choice and vouchers in their state. Any thoughts there on Arizona?
No, you're correct. I mean, the thing about Arizona, as you know, on the charter side, it also started with a very liberal mindset on letting 1,000 flowers bloom. A lot of people contended at the time this was not the right approach because it opened the door to a lot of schools that ended up closing. But because these things took care of themselves, because the reason why a lot of these schools closed wasn't just because of the regulatory infrastructure in Arizona, but because you had more options, and with more options, the schools that were doing better ended up attracting more families. So they actually did test and prove the theory that parents will make better options if you have a good menu of options available to them. And now you have a situation where 1 out of 5 kids is in a charter school. I think with all of these measures that are focused on private choice, the one thing that the charter sector is concerned about, rightfully so, is the competition that it brings, right? I mean, you're going to have competition whenever you have a better school, whether it's public or private. But to the extent that the playing field is not even, so to the extent more money is going with families to private schools, that could disrupt the way things are done in a way that doesn't benefit the overall quality of public education. So, it is what it is, but I think at the end of the day, because charters have been doing this for a longer period of time, because they are free and open to everyone, there are no tests to get into a charter school. They cannot discriminate based on, disability, race, gender, and all those characteristics. I do think they're going to be better mediums for a lot of families than schools that have some restrictions attached to them on who gets in, the tests they have to take to get in, and also to the extent they're being expelled for disciplinary reasons. So, but Arizona has been at the forefront of this for a long time, and I should have mentioned that. So thanks for flagging it.
No worries at all. I want to ask a more federal level related question just on, as we see these state level movements happen and the changes, whether it is in Texas, whether it is in Florida, Arizona, Colorado, Nebraska, Kentucky, some of the places we've touched on. How do you see those state level movements influencing what's going to happen at the federal level? And I mean, I know you just acknowledged we kind of have no idea unless you're in that inner circle that's sort of already feeling like it is in power in Mar-a-Lago at this point. But how do you feel like these state level movements and what's happening at the state level is going to potentially impact what we see at the federal level and just broadly the education landscape?
Well, I do think state level movements have already had an impact on this administration's views on school choice in particular, because most of the red states that have, making strides in the direction of choice and charter schools, like Arkansas, like Tennessee, like Florida, they're all connected to Mr. Trump in one way, shape, or form. And I think a lot of the advocacy and the push for choice in this administration is stemming from the restrictions that came into play during the COVID period, a lot of schools being closed, and parents looking for other options. So that momentum led to a lot of these red states enacting broader school choice measures, and that's given a huge momentum for something at the federal level that's about to happen. So I do think they're paying attention, but their mantra seems to be about empowering parents. And this is the other thing I was going to mention at the top is, if you're sending power and money back to states and localities, you're not necessarily giving it to parents. So there is actually kind of a dissonance or a disconnect between this rhetoric around local control and parental control that anyone who's been in the choice sector is fully aware of. Local control does not mean parental control in most instances. And so it's going to be interesting to see how much, to the extent they devolve block grant money and give it to states for them to make decisions, how that's going to feed and empower a choice movement in many states. But look, education is primarily a state and local issue. This administration knows that. So you are going to pay attention to things that are working and not working, potentially using their bully pulpit to highlight some of those activities. And I think right now, certainly on the science of reading and using methods of teaching reading and math that are based on science, you have some momentum. And I don't know, again, what you want to do at the federal level, but if I were them, I would pay a lot of attention to that. If your goal, again, is to close the achievement gap, putting your resources in things that work are going to get you to the finish line a lot faster. So it will be interesting to see for sure.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you coming on and reading a little tea leaves for what might happen in the next few months. I think we're going to have to make sure you're back maybe in March, April, May, June, when some of these changes start to percolate at the federal level, and we'll have a conversation about what those impacts might look like then. But for now, we try and keep these conversations to 15 to 20 minutes, and we blasted through that threshold. So I'm going to be respectful of everyone that's taken a few minutes this morning to tune in and have a conversation with us here, and say thank you, Nina, for taking the time to have a little chat on what might be on the horizon, given what happened in our last election and where things are standing now as we head towards a transition at the end of January. Really appreciate you being here as always.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Of course, yeah. And we'll say this, we're here every single Tuesday, or should I say most Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern. 10 a.m. Eastern. We are not usually here at 10 a.m. Eastern. We're usually here at 1 p.m. Eastern, but for Nina and I's schedule, we made this happen at 10 a.m. Eastern. But usually we're here at 1 p.m. Eastern every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific, talking all things and challenges that are facing school leaders. So we hope you'll join us in the future for another chat. But for now, we'll say thank you again to Nina, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. Take care.
Bye-bye.